The morning sun painted the Texas plains in shades of gold when Samuel McBride first saw her. She sat by the creek that ran through his newly claimed land, her dark hair flowing like water over her shoulders as she gathered medicinal plants her grandmother had taught her to find. Samuel had ridden out to check his fence lines, but something about the graceful way she moved made him forget all about his ranching duties. Ayanna belonged to a small band of Comanche who had lived on these lands for generations. Her people had watched the world change around them, seen their hunting grounds divided by barbed wire, and their sacred places claimed by strangers with papers they said came from faraway governments. But this particular stretch of land held special meaning for her family. It was where her mother had been born, where her grandmother's spirit still walked, and where the healing plants grew strongest. Samuel didn't know any of this history when he swung down from his horse and approached her. He saw only a beautiful young woman who seemed to belong to the landscape itself, moving among the cottonwoods like she was part of nature's own design. His heart raced as he introduced himself, tipping his hat with the manners his mother had taught him back in Kentucky. Ayanna looked up with eyes that held both curiosity and caution. She had seen enough white men to know that their intentions were not always honorable. But something in Samuel's face seemed different. He spoke slowly, respectfully, even though her English was limited and his Comanche was non-existent. Using gestures and the few words they shared, they managed a simple conversation about the plants she was gathering and the beauty of the morning. Over the following weeks, Samuel found excuses to ride by the creek every day. Sometimes Ayanna was there, sometimes she wasn't. But gradually they began to build a friendship that transcended their different languages and backgrounds. He learned that she was teaching the children of her band about the old ways, that she could read the signs of weather in the clouds, and that she knew every plant and animal on the land as if they were family members. Samuel shared stories about his own life, how he had come west after losing his farm in Kentucky to debts, how he dreamed of building something lasting on this new land. He spoke of his loneliness, of missing his family, of hoping to create a home that would mean something. Ayanna listened with an understanding that went deeper than words, recognizing in him the same longing for belonging that she felt as her own world continued to shrink around her people. Their friendship deepened into something more precious and fragile. Samuel began learning words in her language, while Ayanna's English improved through their daily conversations. He brought her small gifts, ribbons for her hair, books with pictures, seeds from plants that didn't grow in this region. She shared with him the stories of her ancestors, showed him which stars guided travelers, and taught him to read the subtle signs that told when rain was coming or where to find water in dry times. But their growing closeness was not happening in isolation. Samuel's neighbors had begun to notice his frequent rides to the creek, and some had spotted him talking with the Indian girl. Whispers followed him into town when he bought supplies. Fellow ranchers made crude comments about his interest in savage women, while the townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the dangers of getting too close to hostiles. On Ayanna's side, her own people watched with growing concern. Her uncle, a respected elder named Taha, had survived the worst of the Indian Wars and carried deep mistrust of all white men. He had seen too many promises broken, too many treaties torn up, too many young women hurt by men who took what they wanted and left destruction behind. He warned Ayanna repeatedly about the foolishness of trusting any white man, especially one who claimed ownership of their ancestral lands. Despite the pressure from both communities, Samuel and Ayanna continued to meet. They had found in each other something rare and precious, a connection that seemed to bridge the vast differences between their worlds. Samuel began to dream of a future where they might somehow overcome the barriers between them, where love might triumph over prejudice and fear. The turning point came on a warm evening in late summer. Samuel had ridden to the creek with more than their usual conversation in mind. He had been thinking for weeks about asking Ayanna to marry him, to join him in building a life together despite all the obstacles they would face. He had even begun learning about Comanche marriage customs, hoping to approach her family in the proper way. But when he arrived at their usual meeting place, he found not just Ayanna, but also her uncle Taha and 2 other men from her band. The elder's face was stern as storm clouds, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Through Ayanna's translation, Taha made his position clear. Samuel was no longer welcome on these lands, and Ayanna was forbidden from seeing him again. The confrontation grew heated as Samuel tried to explain his honorable intentions, his love for Ayanna, his respect for her people and their ways. But Taha had heard such words before from other white men, and they meant nothing to him. As far as he was concerned, Samuel was just another land thief trying to take advantage of an innocent girl. Samuel's frustration boiled over into anger. All his dreams, all his careful plans, all his genuine feelings seemed to count for nothing in the face of this stubborn old man's prejudice. The civilized manners his mother had taught him began to crack under the pressure of disappointment and rage, setting the stage for choices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The weeks following that confrontation at the creek passed like a fever dream for Samuel. He told himself that Taha had no right to speak for Ayanna, that love should be stronger than the prejudices of old men, that he and she could build a life together if they were just brave enough to seize it. But as days turned into weeks without seeing her, his rational thoughts began to twist into something darker. Samuel started drinking more heavily in the evenings, sitting on his porch and staring toward the creek where he could no longer go. His ranch work suffered as his mind became consumed with thoughts of Ayanna and the injustice he felt had been done to both of them. The other rancher's crude comments echoed in his head, mixing with his own growing resentment, until he could barely tell his own thoughts from theirs. During this time, Ayanna was fighting her own battle. Taha had moved their small band further from the creek, deeper into the hills where white men rarely ventured. But she found herself constantly thinking about Samuel, wondering if he understood why her uncle had acted as he did, hoping that somehow they might find a way to see each other again. She had never experienced feelings like the ones Samuel stirred in her heart, and the forced separation felt like a slow death. Her grandmother, who was wise in the ways of both healing and human nature, watched Ayanna with knowing eyes. She had seen her granddaughter's restless sleep, her distracted manner during daily tasks, the way she gazed toward the direction of the creek when she thought no one was watching. The old woman understood love's power, but she also understood the dangers that came when 2 worlds collided without proper preparation. The crisis came on a night when autumn had begun to paint the leaves with fire. Samuel had been drinking since sunset, his mind churning with anger and loneliness and desire, all mixed together into a poisonous brew. He had heard from a traveling merchant that Ayanna's band was camped in a canyon about an hour's ride to the north. The merchant had mentioned seeing a beautiful Indian girl gathering berries near the camp, and Samuel's heart had leaped with recognition. Against every instinct that told him to wait until morning, to approach in daylight with clear intentions and sober judgment, Samuel saddled his horse and rode into the darkness. The alcohol had stripped away his usual caution and respect, leaving only raw need and a stubborn refusal to accept that what he wanted might be impossible. He found their camp just before dawn, guided by the faint glow of dying embers. Most of the band was still sleeping, but Ayanna was awake, as she often was at that hour, sitting beside her grandmother and listening to the old stories that connected them to their ancestors. When she saw Samuel approaching through the morning mist, her heart jumped with joy and terror mixed together. But the man who dismounted from his horse was not the gentle, respectful Samuel she had known by the creek. This man's eyes were wild with drink and desperation, his movements sharp and unpredictable. When she tried to wake her grandmother, to call for her uncle, Samuel grabbed her wrist and pulled her away from the sleeping camp. "We're leaving," he said in a voice she barely recognized. "Together, tonight. I won't let them keep us apart anymore." Ayanna tried to reason with him, to explain that this was not the way, that taking her like this would only bring tragedy for everyone involved. She begged him to return in the proper manner, to speak with her uncle when the sun was high and minds were clear. But Samuel was beyond hearing her words. All he could see was his chance to claim what he believed belonged to him. He forced her onto his horse, his grip strong enough to leave bruises on her arms. As they rode away from the camp, Ayanna continued to plead with him to stop, to think about what he was doing, to remember the man she had thought she loved. But her words seemed to bounce off him like arrows off stone. By the time the sun was fully up, they had reached Samuel's ranch. He had imagined this moment so many times, had dreamed of bringing Ayanna to his home as his bride, showing her the life they could build together. But the reality was nothing like his dreams. She sat in his kitchen like a caged bird, her eyes full of fear and betrayal, while he paced back and forth trying to convince her that he had done the right thing. "You'll see," he kept saying, his voice getting more desperate with each repetition. "When we're married, when we have children, when your people see how happy you are, you'll understand." This was the only way. But Ayanna said nothing. She had retreated deep inside herself, to a place where her grandmother's spirit could still reach her, where the old songs still had power. She knew that what Samuel had done had broken something precious that could never be repaired. He had taken not just her freedom, but also her trust, her innocence, and her faith that love could overcome the barriers between their worlds. The hours passed in a terrible silence broken only by Samuel's increasingly frantic attempts to justify his actions. He made elaborate plans for their future, described the children they would have, promised to protect her from anyone who might try to take her away. But with each word, he seemed to understand less about the magnitude of what he had done. As evening approached, Samuel heard the sound of horses approaching his ranch. Through his window, he could see Taha and several other Comanche warriors riding toward his house. Their faces were painted for war, and their weapons gleamed in the dying light. Samuel's fantasy of a happy ending crumbled as he realized that his attempt to seize happiness by force had instead unleashed consequences he was completely unprepared to face. But the warriors were not the only visitors approaching his ranch that night. Behind them, moving through the darkness like shadows made flesh, came something else entirely. The old stories that Ayanna's grandmother had told her, the ones about spirits that protected the innocent and punished those who violated sacred laws, were about to prove themselves more real than Samuel had ever imagined possible. As Taha and his men surrounded the ranch house, calling for Ayanna's release, Samuel began to feel something cold settling into his bones. It wasn't just fear of the warriors outside, though that was real enough. It was something deeper, something that seemed to be growing from inside his own chest and spreading through his body like poison. His soul, already stained by what he had done, was about to discover that some prices cannot be avoided, no matter how far a man might run from his crimes. The standoff lasted through the night, but it was not the warriors outside who broke Samuel's spirit. As darkness deepened around his ranch house, something far more terrifying than human vengeance began to manifest. The cold that had started in his chest spread through his entire body, and with it came visions that made him question his own sanity. He began to see faces in the shadows, the faces of Ayanna's ancestors, stretching back through generations of Comanche who had lived and died on this very land. They did not speak, but their eyes held a judgment more terrible than any court of law. Samuel tried to close his eyes, to block out the visions, but they only grew stronger in the darkness behind his eyelids. Ayanna sat in the corner where he had left her, but she was no longer the frightened girl who had been forced onto his horse that morning. Something had awakened in her during those long hours of captivity, a connection to powers that her grandmother had only whispered about in the deepest night. Her eyes now held a light that made Samuel afraid to look directly at her. "You wanted to possess what was not yours to take," she finally spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "But you have only succeeded in losing your own soul." Samuel tried to argue, to explain once more that he had acted out of love, that he had meant no harm. But the words died in his throat as he felt something fundamental shifting inside him. It was as if the very essence of who he was had begun to unravel, leaving behind only a hollow shell filled with echoes of his own guilt. Outside, Taha called for his niece to be released, his voice carrying the authority of generations of chiefs and war leaders. But he also knew that something beyond mere human justice was taking place within those walls. The old medicine woman who traveled with them had felt it the moment they approached the ranch, the presence of spirits who had been awakened by the violation of sacred laws. Samuel staggered to the window, his legs barely able to support him. The warriors outside seemed to flicker between their human forms and something else entirely, shapes made of starlight and shadow, beings who belonged more to legend than to the world he thought he understood. He rubbed his eyes, convinced that exhaustion and guilt were making him see things that could not be real. But when he turned back to Ayanna, she was no longer alone in the corner. Her grandmother sat beside her, though Samuel knew with absolute certainty that the old woman was miles away with the rest of their band. Other figures gathered around them, women in traditional dress, men with faces painted for ceremony, children who looked at Samuel with eyes older than time itself. "This land remembers everything," Ayanna's grandmother spoke, though her lips did not move. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the floorboards, from the very air Samuel breathed. Every drop of blood spilled, every treaty broken, every sacred place defiled, and you, Samuel McBride, have awakened something that should have remained sleeping. Samuel fell to his knees, his hands clutching at his chest as pain unlike anything he had ever experienced tore through him. It was not physical agony, but something far worse. The complete destruction of every lie he had told himself about his actions. He saw himself as the spirits saw him. Not as a man driven by love, but as a thief who had stolen not just a woman, but also her freedom, her dignity, and her people's trust. The visions came faster now, showing him not just what he had done, but what would come after. He saw himself growing old alone, haunted by dreams that would never let him rest. He saw his ranch failing, his cattle dying, his water sources drying up as the land itself rejected him. He saw other men looking at him with the same disgust he had once reserved for the worst kinds of criminals. But worse than any of these earthly punishments was the gradual erosion of his very self. With each passing moment, Samuel felt pieces of his soul being stripped away, leaving behind only the shell of a man who had once believed himself capable of love. The spirits were not destroying him out of cruelty, but out of a justice so pure and implacable that it burned away everything false until only truth remained. "Please," he whispered to Ayanna, crawling toward her across the floor that now seemed to pulse with its own life. "I'm sorry. I never meant. I didn't understand." Ayanna looked down at him with eyes that held both pity and an iron determination that reminded him of her uncle's warrior spirit. "Understanding was your responsibility from the beginning," she said. "Respect was your choice to give or withhold. You chose to take instead of earn, to possess instead of honor. Now you must live with what that choice has made of you." As dawn broke over the Texas plains, the siege ended not with violence, but with a simple opening of doors. Samuel, aged decades in a single night, walked outside with Ayanna beside him. He made no attempt to stop her as she ran to her uncle's arms, made no plea for mercy as the warriors looked upon him with a mixture of contempt and something that might have been pity. Taha studied the broken man before him and saw that no punishment they could inflict would be worse than what Samuel had already brought upon himself. "The spirits have spoken," the elder said simply. "This man is no longer our concern. The land itself will deal with him now." Samuel watched as Ayanna and her people rode away, disappearing into the morning mist like figures from a dream. But he knew they were not the ones who had become unreal. He was the ghost now, a hollow echo of a man who had traded his soul for a moment's selfish desire. In the years that followed, Samuel's ranch became known as a cursed place. Travelers reported seeing lights moving through the abandoned buildings at night, hearing voices speaking in a language that sounded like wind through dry grass. Some claimed to see a broken man wandering the property, searching for something he had lost and could never find again. Samuel himself lived another 30 years, but they were years of a haunted existence. He never married, never formed lasting friendships, never found peace in sleep or solitude. The cold that had entered his chest that terrible night never left him, and with each passing season, more of his humanity slipped away until even his reflection in mirrors seemed to fade. Ayanna went on to become a respected medicine woman among her people, carrying forward the wisdom of her ancestors while adapting to the changing world around her. She married a good man from a neighboring band and raised children who grew up strong in the knowledge of both worlds. But she never forgot the lesson Samuel had taught her about the price of trying to possess what should only be honored. The creek where they had once met in friendship continued to flow, but Samuel never returned to its banks. Some said that on quiet mornings, just as the sun was rising, you could see the ghost of what might have been. Two young people talking and laughing together, their love bridging the gap between different worlds. But that vision always faded with the full light of day, leaving behind only the memory of chances lost and souls forever changed by choices that could never be undone. The land remembered everything, and Samuel McBride's soul had paid the price for forgetting that some things are sacred, some people are not possessions, and some violations leave wounds that never heal. Not in the victim, and most certainly not in the one who chose to inflict them.